Mark Skaar and Listen Iowa with author Martin Popoff to talk about his two recent Black Sabbath books, focusing on the 70s. That one would be called Sabotage, and the 80s and 90s, Born Again. Martin, how are you?
Hey, I'm doing okay. Thanks for having me. Very cool chat with you again.
Yes, absolutely. And let's start chronologically and go back to the Sabotage book, first of all. And I would imagine that you amassed a lot of interviews with the original four members throughout the years and got some quotes from other people. But it's interesting because you spent a lot of time talking with the original manager, Jim Simpson, and, of course, the four guys, Ozzy, Bill, Geezer, and Tony, and various others, some road crew members and so forth. I would imagine that was a lot of fun putting that all together, getting all those conversations in one place.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, this all started with a previous Sabbath book having gone out of print long time ago called Doom Let Loose. So, both of these books have sort of their roots in that, but they're greatly expanded versions of that. And yeah, you're right. I mean, over the years, it's just been very cool getting to chat with these guys, because we had a magazine up here in Canada called Brave Words and Bloody Knuckles, and that started in 1994, and that's kind of when I started doing all this. So I don't go that far back, actually. But I made up for past time by anytime anything cool, like something like a Sabbath interview, some band I grew up with came up, we tried to get in there. And so, a lot of times you do these on the phone, but we had some memorable in-person experiences as well, catching up with these guys.
Yeah, very legendary. And, of course, we start with kind of the club days as the band was Earth and then transformed into Black Sabbath. The first record, some may know, the hardcore fans know, was recorded in like 1 or 2 days. And the kind of one of the strange things about it is Ozzy's vocal on that record.
That's very true. You make a very good point there, because, and we often compare it to Steven Tyler's vocal on the first Aerosmith record. It's similarly low. So both guys are singing kind of lower than you sort of know them to sing. And I remember reading almost a corollary of that. I remember reading about Roger Daltrey in the early days when the Who were more or less more of a hard blues band than what they became, a mod band, essentially. He would kind of adopt the old kind of bluesy, throaty way of singing in homage to those original blues singers. And I remember Steven Tyler kind of coming up with that idea as well, or explanation for what he does. I don't know if that's the case with Ozzy. I believe Ozzy, part of it might have been a little bit of not trying to sound like a little kid. Ozzy has always had a lot of sort of self-confidence issues. And as we know, there was a bit of a dynamic in the early days where Tony essentially was a bully of Ozzy, back in the school days. So I think Ozzy is probably a little nervous in there for the first time, and he wants to sound as grown up as possible, and that might have something to do with him sounding that way.
So then we get to Paranoid, and of course we all know so many of those songs because up until the time they retired, those songs were classics and were in the set list every single year. Maybe the odd time I can remember, Martin, was on the Cross Purposes tour when they didn't play War Pigs.
Yeah, and that's a massive album. I mean, Paranoid is the album that made their career, but they did pretty good right out of the gate. I mean, they got a lot of notoriety off that first album, and I later did a book called Who Invented Heavy Metal. And it's 120,000 words of book, and it ends in 1971. And I kind of make the point in that book that by the time Sabbath made Paranoid and then Master of Reality, it was just obvious if there was anybody who didn't think this was the premier band who loved heavy metal and was making it not by accident at all, i.e. Deep Purple, Uriah Heep, a little bit, in their ways of saying we're not heavy metal, we're jazz, we're progressive rock. We're just rock, heavy metal stupid. Led Zeppelin, same thing, right? Mm-hmm. But with Black Sabbath, after those 3 albums in Volume 4, I mean, all of those as a group, it was just so obvious that this band was so far left field from anybody else when it came to this new music called heavy metal.
Third album was Master of Reality. A lot of people think it's one of the heaviest records ever made.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, I always kind of, I'm Mr. Math when it comes to this sometimes, and there's some quiet things in there, Orchid, Embryo, Solitude. But other than that, I mean, that is just a bulldozing, super heavy album. Probably my second or third favorite Sabbath album, but just so no nonsense in the way it was recorded compared to the first two.
Talking to author Martin Popoff about his Black Sabbath books, and Volume 4 is probably, Martin, where things got a little hazy for the band, starting to get into the drugs.
California, right? And there's a lot of cocaine and stuff around. I don't know. That just seems to be a bit of a side story. I'm not a big fan of Volume 4, and they always talk about how it's this big uptick in sophistication. I don't know if that's particularly the case. I find Sabbath, Bloody Sabbath, and Sabotage to be more of their quote-unquote progressive years. But yeah, Volume 4's it had a lot of songs that lasted, and yeah, went platinum. Master Reality's double platinum, Paranoid's 4 times platinum. I mean, they're a big band at this point.
I think you mentioned in the book, Martin, that your favorite, at least of the Ozzy era, is Sabbath, Bloody Sabbath.
Yeah, more or less that, or tied with Sabotage. I could go either way on any given day. But those two, as a group, to me, are just like the coolest they ever got. They're just like what I like about them is, you could tell there's sort of a franticness and a tiredness, and they're having these problems with management. They're just operating kind of like white knuckled, like just at the edge of their abilities, which is a cool place to be for a rock band. And I think both of those records with the layers and the crazy, Super Desire on Sabotage, and the Red and all these nutty things, Sabracadabra, just even the arrangement of Killing Yourself to Live, like where it goes and the different things and the sounds. Those two records to me are just this group of unassailable. A lot of deep Sabbath fans pick one or the other as their favorites.
And on those two albums, Martin, Ozzy just in the stratosphere vocally, and years later made it really hard on himself.
That's true. He often complained later, just like he does with his Osmosis album, solo album, that the singing was too high, especially on Sabotage, and it made it hard to sing. But yeah, when he sings high like that, and it's not even so much a straight high thing. Like it's not a false falsetto or a real falsetto. It's more like a really cool high screech that he has, which is cool. Kind of like an Ian Gillan kind of high at times.
So then we get into Technical Ecstasy and Never Say Die, and it's you can tell that they're tired, and there's some odd production moments going on there. Still some cool songs throughout, no doubt.
Yeah, those are the records I always go back to in terms of, like, when you're sick of all the other stuff, there's always these that you could always find cool things about that you're not totally sick of. And, you mentioned the production, which is it's a good point. Never Say Die especially has a very garagey production, but Technical Ecstasy is a very clean, and I find it to be a very good production. It doesn't have the warmth. The bass is more of a higher mid-rangey bass, but it's still bassy enough, and it's just got a brightness to it that I really like in the drum sound that you don't hear on Sabotage. Bloody Sabbath doesn't have the greatest sound, but yeah, Technical Ecstasy is I think one of their best sounding albums, and Never Say Die is notoriously considered one of the worst.
Talking with Martin Popoff, we're going to jump to Born Again, the second book, focusing on the 80s and 90s. And, of course, all manner of change goes on throughout. And hopefully the people that are Ozzy only will pay attention, because if they're not, they're really missing out on tons of great music. Of course, Ronnie James Dio comes in 1980, Heaven and Hell right off the bat. What a classic.
Yeah, and I got to say, I'm very sort of enthused that people embraced that second book so well. I mean, I was even debating doing a second book and thinking, I'm only going to do the classic years of all these bands, right? And I just did the same thing with Judas Priest. I did a book called Decade of Domination, which takes you up to 84, and then I did a book called Turbo Till Now, and people are loving that, and they're buying it. So I think it's kind of refreshing to go back and visit these parts of catalogs of of these bands that might be a little later that, like you say, people will dismiss and they won't be into so much. But having said that, Heaven and Hell, of course, and Mob Rules, the original Dio era of 3, is a completely beloved time. And I'm finding that those albums and songs from those albums are really coming up in the ranks a lot as we move through the metal generations of fans. I'm like at the old end of this, but you get people, say, in their 30s and 40s who have more of a nostalgic fondness for the Sabbath of the 80s, and I'm finding that right now. I just had a book called Riff Raff, the top 250 heavy metal songs of the 70s, and Sabbath is all over that thing. But in the follow-up book, which is now with Layout, it's going to be out soon. Things Off of Heaven and Hell just went way up the pole compared to the old time. Long story, but I did a book where I did this poll about 15 years ago. But those songs, the stuff from Mob Rules and Heaven and Hell, is just coming up so fast. I think that those and Born Again are probably the 3 albums that are seeing the most uptick in terms of enthusiasm in the catalog.
Mm-hmm. I kind of jumped in on Heaven and Hell. I'll be 52 soon, and so that's about where I jumped in. And so then you have the first lineup change. You go from Bill Ward to Vinny Appice. Well, the second lineup change, excuse me, obviously from Ozzy to Ronnie. But then you get Mob Rules, and that leads into Live Evil, and who's doing what at what time of day.
Yeah.
Mark 2 or 3 disbands. It just becomes crazy.
Yeah, Born Again is crazy because you've got Ian Gillan in there as a vocalist, and everybody thought that was an incongruous choice. He's running Deep Purple, as famous a band as Black Sabbath. And as I said earlier, a band that kind of puts down heavy metal, and here they go and they make almost their most scary, ghoulish heavy metal album of the whole career so far, with things like Disturbing the Priest and Zero the Heroes, these big doomy songs, super dirty production, the notorious, Little Devil Child on the album cover. But it doesn't, it works and it doesn't. I mean, I actually really do like that album, but I actually like the more Ian Gillan type songs on it, the more Roxy Rollsy songs on it. But yeah, the production almost doomed it to a death, and then obviously immediately after it just all blew up, and Ian went back to Deep Purple, and they had a platinum album with Perfect Strangers.
Right, exactly. And the whole thing with Born Again, the production, as you mentioned, there's been much consternation about it, and it seemed like the left hand didn't know what the right hand was doing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, what happened there was this is sowing the seeds of, basically, they're sending it. This happened on Live Evil as well, which is that's why I'm getting a little confused here, because it's funny. It's almost the same kind of story, but here it's more like the band couldn't be bothered. They're not fighting amongst themselves about the mix so much on this one. That was more of a Live Evil thing, but here they are essentially not caring what's happening, and garbage in, garbage out. This may be more of a case of everything was okay up to a point, but if you screw it up at the end in the mix and you're not around to sort of make sure it's perfect, and you're not paying great attention because you've run off on tour or whatever, or you've run off on vacation, bad things can happen, and that's what happened with that record.
So then Live Aid happens. They get back together with Ozzy. There's Dave Donato. There's Jeff Fenholt. Finally, we get to what was supposed to be a Tony solo record, 7 Star. Again, supposed to be a bunch of guest vocalists, depending on who you talk to. And then the amazing Glenn Hughes sings on it, but he's got his own set of problems and doesn't last long thereafter.
Yeah, this is his big cocaine years, plus he doesn't really fit in the band, even worse than Ian Gillan, because he's more of a, he's from Birmingham, which is nice, and he's an old friend of Tony's, but he has this high voice, and he's a soulful, funky kind of guy. He's got a great solo catalog. I just love all those records he does.
Me too.
But basically, that doesn't last because, I think the cocaine abuse essentially blew out his throat. But it's a pretty good album. It's recorded recorded well. It's got some cool songs on it. They're not particularly Sabbathy songs, but there's some good riffs on there. It's just a good utilitarian Sabbath album, just a weird wrinkle in the catalog.
Then Ray Gillen, the late, great Ray Gillen, comes in, tours, records Eternal Idol, supposedly can't write lyrics. Another switcheroo comes in, and then issues with Jeff Glicksman, the producer. And then we have the birth of the Tony Martin years.
Yes, exactly. So this whole era, I mean, I've talked to a lot of fans, and I think most of them basically think the Eternal Idol is probably the best one of these albums. And, the funny thing about it is, more than anything, this is what I've always said about this record. There's no reason it should be the best. It's almost just like by just happenstance, by coincidence, all the great songs that Tony was writing or writing with whoever, but just basically the package of what you define as a song. It just seems like all of them fell on this record. They could have been on Headless Cross. They weren't. I mean, we sort of learned through Tear and the later albums that the songwriting is actually kind of hard to do, and it's not particularly up to snuff, but just song after song on Eternal Idol is totally memorable. I just loved that album when it came out.
Mm-hmm. Headless Cross brings in, of course, the legendary late, great Cozy Powell, and kind of that situation goes into Tear, and then Dehumanizer comes.
Yeah.
Ronnie James Dio comes back in. There's speculation and rumor, I guess it's fact, that there's actually a Tony Martin version of Dehumanizer, which would be the Holy Grail if that ever came out.
Yeah, that would be pretty cool to hear. I can't remember exactly how specific I come upon that story or set down upon that story in the Born Again book, but that's really interesting. But yeah, there was a lot of subterfuge going on at that time. Tony in, Tony out. Is it going to be Ronnie? They were fighting almost instantly about the whole thing. The Geezer and Tony griped that Ronnie couldn't come up with anything, and Geezer's kind of in there writing the lyrics again. They're trying to write an album that reflects a little bit of the modern, mature, let's deal with the world kind of situation that grunge was good for in terms of sweeping away hair metal. So here you've got a dirty, radical sound. Mac of Queen fame and Sweet is bringing in sort of this wacky drum sound. Vinny likes it. He thought it had a pretty cool drum sound, but a lot of people just find this album just a little too trashy, a little too turgid, a little too slow, and not hooky enough, not commercial enough. So it's kind of a proud, interesting, high class album in that way, that it's not instantly accessible. But ultimately, everybody wants to love Dehumanizer, but nobody really does like it. They really try hard. They really give it the time of day, but they always come out the other end going, I don't need to hear this again for a few months.
Yeah, I think the front half of it's pretty good. I think it's pretty solid, at least halfway there. And then the other dynamic before going into that, Martin, was, of course, the Ronnie Cozy thing, because Cozy Powell is still initially involved.
Yeah, and I'm kind of glad Vinny's in there. I'm not the biggest Cozy fan in the world. I certainly think he's a problem on Headless Cross and Tear. I don't think he sounds well. He certainly doesn't sound good. The production's terrible on Headless Cross. I can't stand that sort of 80s sound on there. But he really doesn't groove. He's kind of like this hard-hitting four on the floor kind of guy. I don't know. Just something about him in most cases I'm not crazy about. I love his work on Rainbow Down to Earth, and I'm pretty happy with it on Rainbow Rising. But on these Sabbath albums, I'm not a big fan. So I'm glad Vinny's in there. Vinny's not particularly Vinny-like on Dehumanizer. Vinny's one of my favorite drummers of all time, but I just find he does a much better job on like Holy Diver and Last in Line, that kind of thing.
Yeah. Talking with Martin Popoff about Born Again and Sabotage, two great books on Black Sabbath, and Cross Purposes brings in another change. Tony Martin's back. Bobby Ronanelli's in, and I think he does a great job on Cross Purposes.
Yeah, there's another one of my favorite drummers of all time. He's got some great stuff in a buddy of mine, Randy Pratt's band, The Lizards.
Yes.
And he's played with Blue Oyster Cult as well. He's just such a groovy, cool drummer. Really, really interesting guy when it comes to his choices of fills at the end of bars and stuff like that. Great guy. So he's one of the secret weapons. But ultimately, it's Tony's band, and still on these two records, everybody pairs together, Cross Purposes and Forbidden. They're considered very similar. I think a lot of people put both of them down. I personally am not a big hater of these records. I think there's some pretty cool stuff on them. I like Tony as a singer, and I also like him as a lyricist. I mean, he can come up with some pretty cool lyrics at times as well. But if I was almost to put a little bit of the blame, though, I would say more so the blame falls on Tony Iommi a little bit on these two records. I just find that the riff writing, there's a self-awareness in this band that starts with the Heaven and Hell album, actually. This sort of, okay, this is what people expect out of us, and then you get that. You don't get that on Born Again, you don't get that on Seventh Star, but you do get that on all the Tony Martin albums and even the Ronnie albums. You just get this idea that Tony's kind of second-guessing himself and going, this is kind of what the fans expect out of us, big, scary, doomy, sounds, and that's what I'm going to do. And that's what's missing from the crazy, eccentric years, especially a record like Sabotage from the old days. You're getting a little bit of a, dare I say, paint by numbers to Cross Purposes and Forbidden.
Of course, Forbidden, Ernie C. from Body Count does that record. It's been panned universally. It's probably my least favorite Sabbath record. Supposedly right now, Tony is remixing it. Yeah,
and the crazy part is Ernie C. did not wreck that record in any way. I mean, the sounds, put it this way, you don't produce Tony Iommi. You don't tell Tony Iommi what to do. So if Ernie C. is responsible for anything on that record, it's the audio, and the audio is perfectly fine. There's nothing wrong with the audio. It doesn't need a remix. What it needs is a rewrite. It needs better songs. So that's what I find a little bit silly about that narrative. It is weird getting Ernie C. in there. The whole story goes is we asked for Ice-T and we got Ernie C. It's a little bit like The Damned. We asked for Syd Barrett to produce our from Pink Floyd to produce our second album, Music for Pleasure, but we got Nick Mason. It's a little bit like that. But it's nothing here is Ernie C.'s fault.
Right, exactly. And then, of course, to end the 90s, you get the reunion, literally, and the reunion itself of the original lineup and the live double album.
Yeah, and that's where I stopped this book. And the reason I stopped this book there, I like the tidiness of, okay, the first book is just called, subtitled Black Sabbath in the 70s. The second book is called Black Sabbath in the 80s and 90s. But the other reason I stopped there is that, and this is a weird reason nobody would know, but essentially I have another Black Sabbath book that's been out for quite a while called Black Sabbath FAQ, and all my best stuff on the whole Heaven and Hell era band, all my Ronnie stuff is used in that book, so I don't like doubling up and using stuff over again, and I don't want anybody to say, hey, this stuff is recycled, except for my very openness about how these books, basically come from a long out-of-print book, but more than doubled in size in terms of word count. But that's really the big reason right there why I didn't go right up to present day with the Sabbath thing. All my best stuff is in a different Black Sabbath book. So if time goes on a little bit and there's more news, who knows, that other book, if it goes out of print and so I feel like I can use all that stuff again, I might do a book that covers the 2000s and the 2010s, but for now we definitely stop here with the reunion.
Martin, do you think there'll ever be a Black Sabbath album by album book like you've been doing with Iron Maiden and AC/DC and Queen, etc.?
I don't think so, because there's another little sort of publishing answer for you. So that publisher, big, huge publisher, great publisher, closed down their music book division. So I did 5 of those album-by-album books, but I haven't had a deal, there isn't. I mean, they actually closed that office and consolidated elsewhere. But there's just nothing in the works in terms of, I don't say never because, they could come back and do music books again. But I would have loved to. I almost got a Black Sabbath one off the ground. I almost got a Kiss one off the ground, a Deep Purple one. But, I'm fortunate we got the 5 done that we did. I mean, that was just so cool. The last one being Queen, where I actually got Paul McCartney. Sir Paul McCartney graciously talked to me for that, so that was cool.
How about that? That's amazing. Yeah, those were fun books. So what are you working on now?
Well, the main thing I have to get done is I want to get this, I'm calling it Aces High, the top 200 heavy metal songs of the 80s out there. And then I'm probably after that going to be getting the 90s one done. So what I did is I had these books called just the top 500 heavy metal songs of all time, and an albums book. But this goes back to 2003, 2004, long out of print. And so I kind of retook the polling all over again because I love questions like this. I love finding the democratic true answer to these things. So I'm gonna basically turn that into a trilogy of books. So yeah, and I think I'm calling the third one War Ensemble, I believe, the top 250 heavy metal songs of the 90s. So it'll be a nice little trilogy of books, and then in each of these, what I do is I write a review of the song, and I have an artist quote for every song. And then also pictures of 45 sleeves, live shots, all throughout. The whole thing goes in reverse order, from 250 up to number 1. And, it'll make three cool little books.
Martin, if people want to order Sabotage and Born Again or anything in the Martin Popoff catalog, how can they go about doing that?
Well, I have martinpopoff.com, and every book is there with a full description and pictures and PayPal buy now buttons for America, Canada, and international. And I sign them all and ship them off right from my office here in Toronto. It's probably the main part of my income these days is the mail order of my own books, actually. So I do appreciate those orders. A lot of people don't know, but a lot of these are printed in the low 3 digits, but I keep a supply of everything from the big publishers on through a lot of these that I'm just doing myself, and these Sabbath are ones that I'm just doing myself. So people are now learning that these things can go out of print, and they stay out of print sometimes. Sometimes they get other deals, sometimes they get foreign language deals. I've got a good British publisher right now, Weimer, great guys, Gary and Jerry over there, and we're putting a few things out. But yeah, martinpopoff.com for anything I've done.
Martin, always a pleasure.
Yeah, thank you, Mark. This has been fun. I didn't expect we'd roll through the catalog like that, but that's very cool. And you obviously know your stuff too, which is also very cool.
Well, thank you very much. For Martin Popoff, I'm Mark Skaar for Listen, Iowa.